Usually when we talk about building a career in the modern world, there is this deeply ingrained expectation of a map, like a very clear topographical map.
Right, yeah, you start at the bottom.
Exactly. You start at the bottom of the mountain. Maybe you're in the mailroom or you're a junior associate just grinding through spreadsheets. And you just follow this clearly marked trail. The company provides the path, you provide the sweat, and eventually, well, theoretically at least, you reach the summit.
It's a very comforting narrative, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, it relies on a structure that is entirely predictable. If you input A, which is, loyalty and hard work, the system outputs B.
Right.
A pension, a gold watch, the house in the suburbs.
Completely comforting. We naturally want things to have a clear trajectory. But then if you step into the modern freelance, the digital gig economy, suddenly that topographical map is just gone.
Completely vanished.
Yeah, you are standing in the middle of an uncharted wilderness without a compass. The terrain is constantly shifting under your feet, and the weather seems to be actively trying to freeze you out.
Which is a terrifying place to be.
It is. So, if you're listening to this and wondering why your freelance grind feels so exhausting, or, why the rules of the corporate world seem to have completely rewritten themselves overnight, that exact wilderness is what we are navigating today.
We have a really intense one today.
We do. We are unpacking a highly provocative, just entirely unapologetic new ebook titled Freedom as a Hamster Wheel, satirizing the delusions of the progressive gig economy. It's written by Conrad Riker. And as a quick reminder, if you want to read along with us, you can grab it on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now. And please don't forget to like and subscribe to our show while you're at it.
And we really need to set the stakes and the context right out of the gate here. For listeners who might be immersed in, the men's rights or red-pilled manosphere spaces, this book is not just being passed around as a casual sociological read.
You're right. It's much more aggressive than that.
Exactly. It is being pitched, quite literally, as a weaponized survival manual for the modern digital economy. It is a highly prescriptive text.
Which brings me to a very important, explicitly stated disclaimer before we dive in. Because this book contains highly charged political and social commentary. Riker heavily critiques feminists, Marxists, and what he repeatedly describes as progressive institutional capture.
He pulls absolutely no punches.
None at all. So we want to make it absolutely clear to you, the listener, that as your guides on this deep dive, we are strictly neutral. We are not endorsing nor are we condemning the author's worldview.
Right. Our job isn't to build a shrine to this text.
And it isn't to burn it down either. Instead, our goal today is to impartially dissect the fascinating architecture of Riker's arguments, look at his historical analysis of our institutions, and thoroughly examine the specific, actionable strategies he is offering to his target audience.
And that is the right approach, because regardless of where you fall on the political or social spectrum, the way Riker constructs his arguments is, well, it's structurally fascinating. He is attempting to diagnose very modern economic anxieties using the tools of classical ancient philosophy.
That's the part I find myself so curious about, honestly. We are talking about dense classical philosophy like Aristotle, John Locke, St. Augustine being utilized as a modern economic playbook for, someone coding on Upwork.
Right.
It just feels like a massive conceptual leap.
It is a massive leap. But to understand how Riker bridges that gap, we first have to look at how he completely inverts the mainstream narrative of the gig economy.
Okay, unpack that a bit. Because the mainstream cultural narrative tells us that gig work, freelancing, the death of the 9-to-5, that all of this is a triumph of flexibility.
Yeah, it's pitched to us as this ultimate liberation from the cubicle. But Riker's core premise is that this flexibility is a monumental lie. He argues that it is actually a highly sophisticated trap designed to isolate, destabilize, and ultimately neutralize the worker.
Wow. So to understand how to survive this modern economy, according to Riker, we first have to understand his version of history, right? How were the traditional corporate institutions dismantled in the first place?
Yes. He starts by looking backward, specifically at the post-WWII economic consensus. We're talking about the era roughly spanning 1945 to 1979.
And understanding his view of this specific era is crucial to grasping his entire framework, isn't it?
It's foundational. He doesn't just look at the mid-century as a period of industrial boom or geopolitical realignment. He defines that corporate structure as a sacred civic vow.
A sacred civic vow. That's strong language.
Very strong.
Yeah.
According to his historical analysis, this was a period that honored the male provider and what he refers to as natural law. The social contract was incredibly clear, and it was heavily enforced by cultural norms. A man offered his stoic resolve, his physical or intellectual sweat, and his absolute loyalty to a hierarchical corporation.
And in Riker's view, that loyalty was actually reciprocated, like the company held up its end of the bargain.
Exactly. He claims the man received a linear trajectory of reward, guaranteeing him the resources necessary to build what Riker calls a fortress for his bloodline.
Fortress for his bloodline. That phrase is so deliberate.
It really is.
Yeah.
Riker envisions the mid-century corporation functioning almost like an extension of an ancient Roman household. It was structured, it was fiercely hierarchical, and he argues it was grounded in the objective reality of human competence.
Right. There were clear metrics for success that weren't subject to emotional interpretation.
Exactly.
He calls it a patriarchal peak. The man ruled his domestic empire, and by doing so, he basically anchored the fabric of civilization. But obviously, that topographical map gets burned. The ladder is dismantled.
Right.
And I'm looking at his explanation for why it was dismantled, and he completely rejects the idea that it was just, technological disruption.
Oh, he fundamentally rejects the standard economic history. Most economists would say, well, the shift to a decentralized gig economy was the natural evolution of globalization, the internet, the shift from manufacturing to services.
Sir, that's the standard textbook answer.
But Riker views it entirely differently. He argues that the feminist left intentionally destroyed this structured patriarchal environment. He views the gig economy as a deliberate legislative and cultural sabotage engineered by what he terms a gynocentric corporate apparatus.
And he doesn't just make vague claims, he points very specific legislation to anchor this. He spends a significant amount of time breaking down the United Kingdom's Employment Rights Act of 1996. Why does he focus so heavily on that specific piece of legislation?
Well, he zeroes in on the Employment Rights Act of 1996 because he describes it as the foundational Trojan horse of the progressive matrix in the labor market.
A Trojan horse. How so?
When that legislation was introduced, the progressive establishment sold it to the masses as a triumph of modern civics. It promised enhanced worker protections, maternity rights, and that golden buzzword flexibility.
Right.
It was celebrated globally as a victory for creating a genderless labor market. But Riker argues that if you look at the structural outcome, it was legally designed to atomize men.
Atomize them into what he calls algorithmic serfs. I want to pause on that phrase for a second because algorithmic serf carries a lot of historical weight.
It's a heavy, deeply intentional juxtaposition. If you think about a serf in the Middle Ages, they were tied to the land. They worked for a feudal lord. But, and this is Riker's key point, that lord had a religious, legal, and social obligation to protect that serf during a famine or a war.
There was a reciprocal, albeit deeply unequal, relationship.
Exactly. Riker argues the modern gig worker is actually worse off structurally. They are tied to a Silicon Valley algorithm that owes them absolutely nothing.
Wow.
It is a machine that will deactivate their livelihood, essentially starving them out if their GPS signal drops for 30 seconds or their completion metric falls by 2%.
Which sets up one of the most striking analogies in the entire book. He compares the modern gig worker to a Pavlovian subject in a corporate Skinner box.
Yes, the Skinner box analogy is central to his thesis.
And for listeners who might be rusty on their behavioral psychology, a Skinner box is an enclosure created by B.F. Skinner where an animal, like a rat or a pigeon, is placed and trained to press a lever in response to specific stimuli. And they usually receive a food pellet as a reward. Riker applies this directly to a freelancer constantly refreshing an app.
It maps perfectly onto his argument. His premise is that men have an innate biological drive for conquest, legacy, and structural authority. But because they have been stripped of the tangible markers of patriarchal success, actual property ownership, single income family viability, corporate ladders, they have to be pacified.
And the system pacifies them through the gamification of labor.
Yes. So the system feeds them digital pellets.
Okay, so what exactly is a digital pellet in this context?
It's a top-rated badge on your freelancer profile. It's a 5-star rating from a client you've never met. It's an algorithmic notification that you had a great week of productivity.
Yeah.
Riker argues that the architects of these platforms deeply understand male psychology. They take that biological drive to conquer, they neuter its real-world impact, and they redirect it into a frantic scramble for virtual table scraps.
You are running on a hamster wheel, hence the title. You are exhausted. You feel like you are working incredibly hard, but structurally you are going completely nowhere.
Precisely.
Okay, I understand the critique of the gig economy being a trap, but I have to push back on his logic here based on his own premise. If the traditional corporate ladder was this sacred civic vow that honored men, and the gig economy is a miserable Skinner box, why does Riker explicitly insist that men should not try to go back to the W-2 lifestyle?
It's a great question.
He actually says that begging for a standard employment contract today is begging for a gilded cage. If the mid-century setup was so ideal, why isn't his manual focused on restoring it?
That is the central paradox he has to address to make his strategy work. He argues that you cannot go back to the W-2 lifestyle because the corporate castle itself has been entirely captured.
Captured by who?
By the ideology we just touched on. The physical ladder, the hierarchy of junior to senior roles, might still exist in some legacy companies. But the ideology guarding the gates of those companies has fundamentally mutated. You would be climbing a ladder inside a burning building.
Okay, so this brings us to his concept of the gynocentric matrix and the mechanics of institutional capture. He essentially declares the corporate ladder a rotting corpse and turns his sights on the ideology that now runs the HR departments and the boardrooms.
Yes. His argument is that modern institutions have been captured by a female-coded Marxist ideology. And to explain how this happened, he doesn't just point to recent Twitter debates. He traces the intellectual lineage all the way back to the Frankfurt School.
Right, he spends time on thinkers like Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno from the mid-20th century, but I think we need to unpack the how here, because how do mid-century German philosophers writing about critical theory end up dictating modern corporate HR policies? What is the actual mechanism of capture?
To understand Riker's perspective, we have to look at what critical theory actually did. Classical Marxism was primarily focused on economics, the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat over capital.
Right, factories and money.
Exactly. But Riker posits that the theorists of the Frankfurt School realized they could not win debates in the arena of objective scientific truth or pure economics, especially as Western capitalism produced massive middle-class wealth.
So the workers weren't going to revolt because they were too comfortable.
Right. So they changed the rules of engagement. They shifted the focus from economics to culture.
And he claims they weaponized Freudian psychoanalysis to do this.
They did. They began to pathologize the traditional Western patriarchal family. In their framework, the traditional father was not a necessary provider and protector. He was reframed as a psychological oppressor, a localized fascist, essentially.
Really?
But the most crucial mechanism of capture, according to Riker, was that they successfully replaced the pursuit of objective truth with a relentless critique of power structures. And the metric for that critique became subjective harm.
Ah, the epistemology of harm. This is arguably the most fascinating philosophical detour in the source material, because he contrasts the historical definition of harm with the modern corporate definition. Historically, harm had a very strict, very tangible definition.
It did. It was deeply rooted in Roman law and John Locke's theories of property. In classical legal frameworks, harm meant a physical injury to your person or the physical theft or destruction of your property.
It was tangible. It was objective. You could prove it in a court of law with physical evidence.
Exactly. But now, Riker argues, the definition of harm has been deliberately expanded to mean psychological discomfort.
And that expansion is the ultimate weapon of what he calls the progressive matrix, right?
It is the ultimate weapon. Think about the implications of that shift. If harm is subjective, if it simply means someone feels emotionally distressed or unsafe because of a factual statement or a differing opinion, it allows fragile ideologues to completely silence debate.
Right, you can't argue with someone's feelings.
You can't. Riker argues you cannot have the classical Greek ideal of the agora, the open marketplace of ideas where logic wins if one side has the power to simply claim that your logic is harmful to their emotional safety and therefore must be banned.
He takes this concept and applies it to the modern corporate world, and by extension, the gig economy platforms that mimic these corporate HR policies. He notes that the modern economy constantly demands vulnerability and emotional intelligence.
EQ, right?
Yeah. Most business books frame EQ as a vital soft skill, but Riker frames it as a psychological weapon designed specifically to neutralize male authority.
He views it as a malicious double-bind. The corporate system commands men to be vulnerable, to share their feelings, to bring their authentic selves to work. But Riker observes that the millisecond a man expresses authentic male anger at a systemic injustice, or expresses a biologically rooted desire to unapologetically lead, he's immediately diagnosed as toxic.
Right.
He's penalized by the HR tribunal, or in the freelance world, his platform account is flagged for unprofessional behavior. Riker's point is that you cannot be a strong, autonomous leader and a vulnerable victim simultaneously. The captured system, he argues, demands that you adopt the posture of the latter.
Which leads to his observation of what is happening to the workforce itself as a result of this ideology. He calls it the bifurcation of labor.
Yes.
Because if the standard corporate environment is a trap, where's the red-pilled man actually supposed to work?
Riker observes that the modern economy is naturally splitting into two distinct, highly segregated spheres based on these ideological friction points.
Okay, let's break those down.
The first sphere is the masculine economy. He defines this as tangible, logical, high-friction work. We are talking about hard engineering, complex logistics, high-value physical trades, back-end programming, systems architecture.
Work that relies on objective outcomes. The material reality. Does the code compile? Does the bridge hold weight? Does the supply chain deliver the goods?
Yes. In the masculine economy, your feelings about the code do not matter if the code doesn't execute.
Right.
On the other side of the divide is what he calls the feminine economy.
Oh.
He defines this as low-friction, highly emotional, HR-compliant work. This encompasses digital influencer networks, community management, diversity and inclusion consulting, much of modern marketing.
It's work where the value is entirely subjective and based on social consensus rather than an objective material output.
Exactly.
And his advice to his readers regarding this bifurcation is incredibly blunt. He tells them to ruthlessly exploit the masculine economy and completely, utterly ignore the feminine economy. He basically says, let them starve in their digital echo chambers while you control the material reality they actually depend on to survive.
It is a strategy of aggressive divestment. He is telling his audience to stop trying to argue with or fix the captured corporate culture. He wants them to bypass it entirely by focusing exclusively on hard, irrefutable skills that the market cannot function without.
But practically speaking, I have to challenge this. I mean, even if you are a back-end programmer who only deals in objective code, you don't code in a vacuum.
Right.
You still have to deal with clients, project managers, or platform moderators who might be completely steeped in this HR culture. How does Riker suggest a freelancer actually deal with these corporate gatekeepers when interaction is unavoidable?
That is where he introduces the concept of the subservience premium.
The subservience premium.
Yeah, it is a highly tactical and honestly somewhat humorous economic mechanism he has designed for exactly this scenario.
Walk us through how a freelancer actually implements a subservience premium without just getting fired.
The logic works like this. If a client insists on bringing the rules of the feminine economy into a business transaction, meaning they demand emotional labor, they require endless corporate pandering, or they insist on tedious catch-up meetings about team feelings, rather than just looking at the project deliverables, the red-pilled freelancer does not complain.
He doesn't write a manifesto.
He doesn't write a manifesto. He doesn't whine about it on Twitter.
He just taxes them for it.
Exactly. Riker advises his readers to silently apply a 40% yes man tax to the invoice.
40%.
40%. If the client wants the freelancer to act like a submissive corporate drone, they have to pay an absolute premium for the freelancer's compromised dignity. The freelancer provides the emotional validation the client craves, but extracts heavy capital in return.
It turns an ideological annoyance into a highly profitable revenue stream. It's basically treating their progressive ideology as a luxury feature that they have to pay out of pocket for.
That's a great way to frame it.
It's a fascinating mental pivot. And knowing that the environment is hostile is one thing, but surviving it daily without losing your mind is another. This is where Riker doesn't just suggest complaining about the environment. He looks backward to ancient Rome and the Enlightenment to forge a kind of tactical armor.
This is a major structural shift in the book. It moves from sociological critique into a very rigid philosophical survival manual. He takes the dense intellectual traditions of Western history and applies them directly to the granular mechanics of gig economy work.
He structures the middle of the book around applying the logical rigor of Aristotle, the stoicism of Marcus Aurelius, and the scientific method of Francis Bacon to everyday freelance life. And the central piece of armor he creates from synthesizing these philosophies is what he calls the Iron Mask. Let's unpack the Iron Mask, because it sounds like cognitive compartmentalization on steroids.
It is exactly that. The Iron Mask is a psychological construct designed for endurance. Riker recognizes that, inevitably, gig workers will face mandatory corporate sensitivity training, or they will have to endure an irrational client berating them over a perceived microaggression.
Right.
To survive this without compromising one's internal sovereignty, He advocates for projecting an outward posture of polite, smiling compliance.
That's the mask. You smile, you nod, you appear completely subservient to the HR mandate.
But underneath that mask is an inner, unbreakable fortress of red-pilled conviction and unyielding masculine pride. When you are sitting on a Zoom call for a mandatory diversity seminar, you completely disengage emotionally.
You treat the speaker like a poorly programmed machine.
Exactly. You do not absorb the ideology. Instead, you use that time behind the mask to mentally plan your financial strategies or to architect a piece of code in your head.
He grounds this deeply in classical Stoicism, specifically relying on Epictetus's dichotomy of control. Can we explain how a philosopher from ancient Greece helps a guy dealing with an Upwork shadow ban?
Epictetus taught that the foundation of a tranquil, powerful mind is the rigorous separation of things you can control from the things you cannot control. Riker maps this perfectly onto the gig economy. You cannot control the uncontrollable volatility of platform algorithms. You cannot control if a client suddenly gets offended by something trivial.
Because agonizing over those things is a waste of masculine energy.
Right. But what do you maintain absolute control over? You control your own skill acquisition. You control your mastery of JavaScript. You control your copywriting speed. And most importantly, you control your emotional response to setbacks.
And to build this iron mask, he doesn't just suggest casually reading meditations before bed. He mandates a strict physical and mental routine to start the day. He calls it the morning citadel.
The morning citadel is non-negotiable in his framework. And crucially, it does not begin by checking emails or looking at social media notifications. Riker views the act of waking up and immediately checking your phone as a fast track to female-coded emotional reactivity.
You are letting the outside world dictate your internal state before you've even gotten out of bed.
Right.
Instead, it begins with intense physical exertion, specifically hypertrophic weight training.
Yes, heavy lifting. And he makes a neurobiological argument here, not just an aesthetic one. He argues that the gig economy is intentionally designed to keep you in a state of chronic, low-level anxiety.
Because you never know when the next gig is coming.
Exactly, or if an algorithm will penalize you. This floods your system with cortisol, the stress hormone. Weight training is meant to physiologically prime the body. It optimizes testosterone production and physically burns off that accumulated cortisol. And this physical exertion is followed immediately by 15 minutes of stoic journaling.
It sounds to me like he's training his readers to treat the gig economy not as a workplace, but as a hostile wilderness. If an algorithm cuts your pay by 20%, you don't cry to HR because there is no HR in the wilderness.
That's right.
You treat the algorithm like bad weather. You don't scream at a thunderstorm for raining on you. You just build a stronger roof. But I want to ask you about this neurobiological claim he makes. He asserts that cognitive framing, using Stoicism, literally alters the amygdala's stress response. Is he just using scientific jargon metaphorically, or is there teeth to this?
Oh, he is pointing to a very real synthesis of ancient philosophy and modern neuroscience. The amygdala is the fear center of the brain. It processes threats and triggers the fight or flight response.
Right.
When a freelancer loses a major contract unexpectedly, the natural biological response is a spike in the amygdala. Panic. But Riker argues that by consciously, repeatedly applying stoic detachment, by actively framing that lost contract not as a personal failure or a catastrophic existential threat, but merely as an impersonal expected market fluctuation, you can literally downregulate the amygdala's panic response over time.
Wow, he calls it the alchemy of anxiety. You convert the raw panic of financial uncertainty into focused, aggressive action. You take the biological energy of fear, and instead of venting about capitalism on a Reddit forum, you spend that energy cold emailing 3 new clients.
It requires immense discipline, which is exactly why he insists on the daily physical and philosophical conditioning of the morning citadel. You have to train your brain's neural pathways to react to chaos with logic, rather than defaulting to emotion.
But surviving the wilderness alone, even if you have an iron mask and a perfectly disciplined amygdala, is still incredibly dangerous. Humans are social creatures. Which leads us to Riker's strategy for networking outside of this ideological matrix. He presents the concept of the brotherhood of competence and contrasts it with what he calls the NPC zombie apocalypse.
Before he builds his network, Riker is very quick to tear down a popular myth in his own circle. He dismisses what he calls the toxic fallacy of the lone alpha male.
Because if you spend any time on the internet, there are countless gurus claiming that a true alpha needs absolutely no one, that he is an island of self-reliance.
And Riker completely destroys this idea. He argues that isolating yourself in a one-bedroom apartment, fighting algorithmic shadow bans all by yourself, is exactly what the gynocentric system wants you to do. It makes you atomized, weak, and easily picked off by the machine.
So the alternative is forming this brotherhood of competence. He describes it as a highly vetted, high-trust mastermind group. But he is very specific about the size. He suggests a group of exactly 4 to 6 men. Why such a small, rigid number?
Because the entire concept relies on absolute trust and ruthless curation. If the group gets too large, it dilutes the trust and introduces politics.
Right.
This is not a social club. It's not a support group for men who are ideologically broken and want to complain. Every man in this circle must have a proven, undeniable track record of hard competence in his field, and he must be entirely immune to ideological capture.
What exactly do they do in this brotherhood?
The purpose is tactical survival and economic advancement. They share unfiltered market intelligence. They warn each other about hostile corporate policies or problem clients.
Like an early warning system.
Exactly. And most importantly, they completely bypass the politically correct HR gatekeepers by funneling work, subcontracts, and resources directly to each other.
It's essentially building a parallel economy.
It's a digital age Roman legion. They hold each other to a private, rigorous standard of excellence that the mainstream culture simply no longer enforces.
And he contrasts this elite, high-trust brotherhood very sharply with his description of the progressive left. He uses gaming terminology here, referring to them as NPC zombies, non-player characters.
Right.
And for the non-gamers listening, an NPC is a character in a video game that has no agency, no internal life, and only repeats a few pre-programmed lines of dialogue when you click on them. Rigor uses this to describe the ideologically possessed individuals running the corporate world. But his explanation for why they act this way takes another massive philosophical detour into the theology of St. Augustine.
It is a brilliant, highly contentious application of 4th century theology. St. Augustine of Hippo spent a great deal of his life struggling with the philosophical problem of evil. Before his conversion, he flirted with Manichaeism, which viewed evil as a dark, substantive force fighting against good.
Okay.
But Augustine eventually concluded that evil is not a substantive thing at all. Rather, it is a privation of good. Just as darkness is not a substance but merely the absence of light, evil is a lack of goodness.
Like how a hole in a shirt isn't a material, it's the absence of the fabric. So how does Riker apply a 4th century theological framework to a 21st century gig economy network?
Riker takes this theological framework of privation and applies it directly to human intellect. He argues that these NPC zombies are not evil masterminds actively plotting destruction. Rather, they are empty vessels suffering from a profound privation of logic.
They don't think, they simply compute pre-programmed buzzwords.
That is his exact claim. He argues they have abandoned the pursuit of objective truth in favor of whatever synthetic, socially approved narrative validates their fragile egos. Therefore, when they encounter a hard fact that contradicts their programming, their operating system effectively crashes. Because they lack the logical tools to debate the fact, they default to rage.
He illustrates this dynamic with a very specific real-world case study from 2017, the Brett Weinstein incident at Evergreen State College. He devotes a lot of ink to this.
That event serves as Riker's primary, foundational case study for the NPC phenomenon. Brett Weinstein was an evolutionary biology professor. In Riker's framing, Weinstein is a man of science operating entirely within the classical Enlightenment tradition of logic and reason.
Right.
When Weinstein politely objected to a campus initiative that asked white people to leave campus for a day, a policy he viewed as factually and morally flawed, he attempted to engage the student body and faculty in a rational, civilized debate.
And the response he received was, well, certainly not a debate.
The response was what Riker categorizes as narcissistic mob violence. The collective student body did not respond to his Aristotelian logic with counter-arguments. They responded with screaming, physical intimidation, and an absolute terrifying refusal to engage with objective reality.
Wow.
Riker uses this historical moment to prove a central tenet of his manual. You cannot reason with an entity that has completely abandoned reason.
So if you can't reason with them, but you sometimes still have to deal with them to get an invoice paid or a project approved, how do you handle an NPC without losing your own stoic frame? This brings us to a tactic he calls the Columbo method.
The Columbo method is Riker's meta-debate strategy for handling ideological capture in professional settings. He names it after the old television detective Columbo, who always played dumb, bumbled around in a trench coat and asked seemingly innocent questions to catch the suspect in a lie.
How does a freelance coder use the Columbo method on a Zoom call?
When a client or a middle manager starts spouting irrational, ideologically driven demands, perhaps insisting on a project change that makes no logical sense but satisfies a diversity quota, the red-pilled freelancer does not get angry.
Right.
He does not throw a tantrum or try to teach them Aristotle. He cultivates what Riker calls androcentric rage, which is cold, highly strategic, and perfectly controlled. Instead of arguing the facts, you ask targeted, very polite questions that force the other person to explain the logical conclusion of their own absurdity.
You play dumb to make them talk themselves into a corner.
Precisely. You make them do the exhausting work of exposing their lack of a substantive argument. You remain perfectly calm, wearing the iron mask, while their argument naturally collapses under the weight of its own paradoxes. The goal is not to change their mind. Riker says that's impossible, but to safely navigate around their malfunction, to protect your project and your income.
Which brings us to the ultimate goal of all of this. We've covered the history, the stoic endurance, the iron mask, the brotherhood, the Columbo method. But the point of all this armor isn't just to win arguments on Slack or survive a Zoom call. The point is to secure the bloodline and build actual generational wealth. We are talking about redefining the provider role and achieving deep financial fortification.
Yes, all the classical philosophy and neurobiology is ultimately bent toward a very practical, very aggressive economic end. Riker claims that the fundamental biological imperative of man is to provide for and protect his lineage. But he argues that the modern welfare state has aggressively positioned itself as the ultimate beta provider, deliberately designed to replace the father in the home.
And just like he did with the gig economy, he traces the history of this state capture back centuries. He points specifically to the 1834 New Poor Law in the UK.
He views the 1834 New Poor Law as the origin point of this ideological poisoning of the family structure. Prior to that, relief for the poor was handled locally, often by parishes. The 1834 legislation centralized it and made state relief conditional on entering a workhouse.
Okay.
Riker argues this incentivized the destruction of the family unit by forcing men to essentially abandon their homes for punitive labor just to keep their families fed. He draws a straight, unbroken line from that 19th century law to modern welfare policies, specifically citing the 2002 Tax Credits Act in the UK.
I understand the historical jump, but how does the 2002 Tax Act fit into this narrative of replacing the father?
He argues that the modern state actively uses the tax code to financially reward single motherhood and dual-income corporate servitude, while simultaneously penalizing the single-income traditional patriarchal family. He claims the state essentially subsidizes female hypergamy. In his view, women can now outsource the provider role to the government. The government becomes a surrogate husband, but one with a bottomless bank account that is funded by the taxes extracted from the very men it is actively displacing.
It reduces fathers to, in his words, heavily taxed ATM machines who have no actual authority in their own homes. So, to fight this dynamic, he demands an aggressive, total reframing of how a man views his labor. A man must stop viewing himself as just a worker, or even as an independent contractor. He must elevate his mindset and view himself as the chief executive officer of his bloodline.
And as a CEO, he must completely and utterly reject the modern internet guru dream of passive income.
That was one of the most surprising parts of the book for me. The entire freelance internet is obsessed with passive income. The image of the guy sitting on a beach in Bali with a laptop, letting the money roll in while he drinks a coconut. Riker absolutely despises that imagery.
Oh, he is venomous toward it. He calls the pursuit of passive income a spiritual cancer. He defines it as a female-coded desire for unending provision without labor. Riker insists that true masculine fulfillment requires the hunt.
Right?
A lion does not want his meat delivered by a drone. He wants the physiological thrill of the chase. The patriarchal approach isn't passive income, it's automated control. You build digital systems that run highly efficiently, but you never detach. You remain the active, omnipotent architect of those systems, constantly refining and expanding your territory.
To make these high-level concepts concrete, he provides several case studies of men in his network who have successfully executed this strategy. Let's look at Elias and Arthur because they demonstrate exactly how to bypass the captured institutions. Let's start with Elias.
Elias is a fascinating case study in applying the Iron Mask to modern tech infrastructure. He was a highly competent cybersecurity professional working in a standard corporate environment. According to Riker's telling, Elias was essentially fired for exhibiting what the HR department labeled toxic masculinity.
Which Riker clarifies just meant Elias was unapologetically assertive, demanded high standards from his team, and refused to participate in mandatory pronoun rituals in his email signature. So, what did Elias do when the corporate matrix rejected him?
He didn't apologize to try and save his job, and he didn't waste years in a lawsuit. He took his undeniable high-friction skill set and became an independent cybersecurity consultant. But more importantly, he anticipated that the ideological capture extended to the banking sector.
Because he realized they could just freeze his money.
Exactly. To avoid ideological account freezing, which is when mainstream payment processors like PayPal or Stripe cut off your funds because your political views violate their terms of service, Elias bypassed the fiat financial system entirely. He leveraged Web3 and crypto infrastructure, demanding payment from clients in stablecoins and Bitcoin.
Wow.
He secured his wealth through cryptographic truth, completely outside the jurisdiction and reach of the corporate HR matrix.
He built a direct-to-client infrastructure that couldn't be censored. And then there is Arthur, the copywriter based in Manchester. His story deals with a different kind of institutional blockade.
Arthur's story is about navigating the legacy financial system. Arthur used Enlightenment empiricism, meaning he constantly A/B tested his copy, relentlessly tracked data, and refined his pitches based on objective market feedback to build a massive, highly lucrative freelance copywriting empire. But when Arthur went to buy a large multi-bedroom property to house his traditional single-income family, he hit a wall.
The modern mortgage system?
Yes, the retail mortgage system heavily favors the dual-income corporate couple with predictable W-2s. It actively penalized Arthur for being an independent contractor, despite his income being significantly higher, labeling him a high-risk borrower.
It's the system passively trying to drag him back to the W-2 plantation.
Exactly. So Arthur didn't write a complaining blog post about the injustice of banks. He engaged his intellect. He formed a holding company. He retained his freelance earnings within that corporate structure, structured his own dividends to show a consistent, predictable corporate salary, and utilized private wealth channels to secure the asset.
Incredible.
He completely bypassed the biased algorithms of the retail banking sector by playing a higher-level financial game.
Which brings up the capstone of Arthur's strategy, a concept Riker calls the family charter.
The family charter is Arthur's crowning achievement in Riker's eyes. It is not a metaphor. It is a physical, legally binding document outlining the family's core values, their financial operating procedures, and their generational goals. It unashamedly establishes the father as the CEO with veto power over major structural decisions.
That's a huge commitment.
It is. Riker views this as a localized constitution, a necessary legal and psychological barrier protecting the bloodline from the influence of the state.
If we connect this back to the classical philosophy we discussed earlier, Riker is essentially taking John Locke's labor theory of property and turning it into a modern digital rebellion. Locke famously argued that in the state of nature, if you mix your physical labor with the unowned commons like tilling a field, that land becomes your property.
Right.
Riker updates this. If you mix your coding skills, your logistics expertise, or your copywriting with the unowned digital commons of the internet, that capital is yours by natural law. But how does Riker suggest listeners fight back when the state, or the platform algorithms, inevitably try to take that capital away?
The ultimate defense mechanism he preaches is extreme decentralization paired with extreme competence. You never ever rely on a single platform like Upwork or Fiverr because an algorithm can shadow ban you in a millisecond and wipe out your income.
You capture your own client emails?
Yes. You build your own proprietary distribution networks. And most importantly, you scale your intelligence and your skill set so vastly that you become indispensable to the market. The algorithm does not care about your politics. It only cares about output and efficiency.
It's pure math.
Exactly. If you are the absolute best at what you do, the algorithm is mathematically forced to reward you. You use the merciless pragmatism of the machine as a weapon against the ideological fragility of the culture.
You treat the platform not as your boss, but simply as a distribution channel. The algorithm is just the weather. You build shelter, you plant crops that are resilient enough to survive a drought, and you harvest what you need.
It's a very powerful framework.
It is an incredibly stark, stunning reframing of modern economic reality. Which brings us to our final synthesis. As we wrap up this deep dive into the complex architecture of freedom as a hamster wheel, how do we summarize the ultimate goal for the reader? Riker calls this end state the multifaceted man.
The multifaceted man is Riker's ultimate answer to the progressive matrix's demand for hyper-specialized, emotionally compliant corporate cogs. Throughout the book, he completely destroys the feminist straw man of the patriarch as a grunting caveman who just wants to dominate people through brute force.
Right.
Riker's ideal patriarch is not an unthinking brute at all. He is a highly optimized, intensely disciplined force of nature who combines aggressive market dominance with a deep appreciation for art, philosophy, and classical reason.
He reclaims the multi-domain excellence of the Western inheritance.
Exactly. Riker's ideal man codes back-end systems in Python. He lifts heavy weights to optimize his neurobiology. He reads Aristotle in his leisure time, and he actively, physically shapes the moral and financial destiny of his children. He is sovereign because he is undeniable. He is competent in every single domain that matters to human survival.
And for you, the listener, if you want to understand the history of institutional capture, and if you want to see exactly how the manosphere is forging a new, aggressive path through the digital wilderness using the tools of the Enlightenment, this book is your manual. Before we leave you today, a final urgent reminder. Please like and subscribe to this show. Open up Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now to buy Freedom as a Hamster Wheel, and make sure you go follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to explore his concepts further.
It is a text that absolutely demands engagement. Whether you accept its premises as gospel, or whether you merely wish to understand the shifting, volatile tectonic plates of modern male psychology.
Exactly. And as we leave you to navigate your own professional wilderness, whatever that looks like, I want to leave you with one final lingering question to mull over. Riker builds an incredible, airtight architecture for dominating the gig economy through sheer human logic, coding prowess, and masculine drive. He relies heavily on the premise that the algorithm is a neutral, amoral judge of human competence. But if the gig economy is truly a ruthless, Darwinian algorithm, what happens to the freelance fortress when artificial intelligence eventually automates the very high-friction, logical programming and copywriting tasks that Riker claims are the ultimate masculine domain? When the machine can eventually write the Python code better and faster than the man, will the algorithm still reward the patriarch? Or will a machine itself become the ultimate beta provider, leaving the multifaceted man with no wilderness left to conquer? Something to think about as you chart your map tomorrow.